Here's how I turned a pile of gray plastic into these deadly covert Mandalorians. Stealthy, stylish, and ready for the tabletop. Let's rewind. First up, the female Mandalorian. She's got this awesome mid-flight pose. Feet off the ground, jetpack holding her up. It looks cool, but those tiny connection points? Yeah, they're just begging to snap. To help with that, I'm gluing the sole of her foot to the smoke trail coming out of the jetpack. It adds a bit more support, and it still sells the illusion that she's mid-flight. I'm using some super thin super glue and just holding it in place for a bit. Nothing fancy, just patience. I'll let it cure properly before moving on to priming. Like most minis I paint, I'm priming this one black. It's a solid base, makes shadows easier and keeps things looking gritty. I'm keeping the pants black, so I grabbed some gray panel liner to pick out that seam running down the leg. In hindsight, a gloss varnish first would have helped a lot, but since it's enamel, I can clean up the mess once it's dry. No harm done. Once the panel liner dried, I went over the pants with a charcoal-colored paint, just to clean everything up and smooth out the look. I used Vallejo Game Color, which is kind of my go-to for miniature painting. The covert Mandos are an interesting bunch. All the Mandalorian supports are solid, but these might be the best of the lot. And since they're covert, not tied to any one clan, you've got way more creative freedom. Paint them however you like, no lore police here. We decided to go with a purple and turquoise color scheme to match the terrain we painted up for Felucia. If you haven't seen that one, check it out. It's a pretty wild color palette. For the dark gray pants, we worked from shadows to light, starting with a mix of charcoal and a bit of Stonewall Gray. From there, we just kept adding more Stonewall Gray to build up the highlights. Nothing too crazy though. These are just the pants, not the focal point, so we're not taking it too far. I usually just go back and forth between the lights and shadows until I get something I'm happy with. It's not an exact science, just a bit of back and forth until it feels right. If you're curious about the brushes I'm using, they're Rosemary & Company Kolinsky Sable brushes. Easily the best I've found for the price. There's a link in the description with all the brushes I use. If you grab something through the affiliate link, it helps the channel and lets them know I sent you. Next up was the cloak. I was originally going to paint it gray, but once I saw it next to the pants, it just felt too dark. So I pivoted to a deep purple instead. I didn't want the cloak to match the armor exactly, so I made sure this purple leaned more toward red. The armor's going to be a more pure, vibrant purple, if that makes sense. You'll see it come together. Once the base coat dried, I set up 3 reddish purples on the wet palette and added some glaze medium to keep them workable longer. Capes and flowing fabric always throw me a bit, but I'm giving wet blending a go on this one. We'll see what happens. First, I reapply the base coat over the entire cloak to keep the surface wet. Then I start blending in some deep magenta and squid pink. The key here is making sure the surface stays wet and keeping all your brush strokes moving in the same direction. That's what helps create those smooth, fabric-like transitions. You'll probably notice I'm using 3 pretty different colors here. One of them's not even purple, it's straight up pink. I do this on purpose. The transition happens in the blend, so if your colors are too close together, like sitting next to each other on the color wheel, you'll barely notice the shift. Big jumps give you drama. Go bold. Those who dare, win. The downside to wet blending is that, while it's still wet, it can be kind of hard to see how it's turning out. But if you don't like the result, just go over it again. Wet blend the wet blend. No big deal. You'll also notice I'm not really cleaning my brush between colors. I do rinse it now and then, especially during the final blend or when the bristles get overloaded and there's more pigment than water left. Just something to keep an eye on. I've sped up the footage here, but all the blending is done on camera. And as you can see, it's actually a pretty quick process. I highly recommend giving it a try, especially if you're new to painting. It looks fancy, but it's really approachable once you get the hang of it. Don't let the word wet blending scare you. It's basically just mixing paint. Fast. Alright, time for the purple armor. I'm starting with the shadow color, Hexed Lichen. It's a deep, rich purple that makes a solid foundation for everything else to sit on top of. This will probably need 2 coats to get a solid, even base. I'm not wet blending this one. Instead, I'm going with a combo of edge highlighting and a bit of non-metallic metal-style shading to push the volumes. If you're into printing your own custom Mandalorians, or really anything else, I highly recommend Anycubic for resin printing. I've been using their printers for years and honestly haven't found anything better. The print quality's great, and their customer service has always been solid. There's an affiliate link down below, and if you use the code PAINTWISE, you'll get $20 off your purchase, and it helps support the channel too. Next, I'm sketching in the highlights across the armor, basically drawing in where the light and reflections will hit. No blending yet, just rough placements. The goal is to make sure that from most angles, you can spot both shadows and highlights. It gives the model a strong visual read before we start refining anything. Think of it like laying down the blueprint for the final look. I'm also adding some edge highlights as I go. A good sharp brush tip is essential here. This is where brush control really matters. Take your time and think carefully about where the light would naturally catch the edges. It's all about reinforcing that light and shadow placement we sketched in earlier. For the final highlight, I'm adding one more brighter color, Lustful Purple. I'm layering this inside most, but not all, of the areas I highlighted earlier. It adds a pop of contrast and helps define the form. I'm also hitting some of the sharpest and highest edges to really push the effect. It's a small touch, but it does a lot of the heavy lifting. Here's how she's looking so far. Depending on your art style, time, and patience, you could totally stop here. She'd look great on the tabletop, but for me personally, I can't leave it as just a sketch. I've got to blend those layers. It's just how my brain works. Now we're going back to the original colors we used on the armor, but this time we're turning them into glazes. I mix in some glaze medium and a bit of water until the paint is super thin, very watery and translucent. Before it goes anywhere near the model, I test it on my fingernail or the back of my hand. If I can still clearly see my skin tone through the color, then I know it's the right consistency. It should be see-through, not milky. This step's all about control, not coverage. This next part is definitely the most time-consuming, so I've sped up the footage so you can actually see it working. When you load up your brush, make sure to wick away the excess paint. This process needs strict control over how much paint hits the model. If you skip that step, you'll probably flood the surface. But don't panic if it happens. The paint's so watery you can usually just wipe it away with a clean brush or a paper towel if you're fast. No harm done. I think of this step more like watercolor than traditional acrylic painting. The paint's super thin, so it behaves differently. You're building up soft layers, not laying down solid coats. I like to use a stippling motion here instead of brushing. It helps avoid brush marks and gives a smoother transition. Just be gentle, especially if you're using a Kolinsky sable brush. You don't want to fray the tip. It takes a bit of practice to get the feel for it, but once it clicks, it's absolutely worth learning. One tip that took me a while to figure out: don't keep stippling the same spot over and over. Even if it's not perfect on the first go, just let it dry and come back to it later. That's how you build smooth transitions without damaging the layer underneath. Trust the process. Overworking it is the fastest way to wreck it. As you'll see, this technique naturally shrinks the highlight areas. That's why it's important to be really generous when you're doing your initial sketching. Leave yourself room to blend. It takes a bit of forward thinking, but making sure those highlights are big enough at the start saves you a lot of work later. And hey, if you do undershoot it, it's not the end of the world. You can always go back and glaze stipple the highlight color again. It just adds more time to the process, so keep that in mind. Lastly, I'm taking a tiny amount of pure white and dabbing it into the sharpest corners and the center of a few key highlights, like the helmet and breastplate. Just a little dot of white can make those spots pop and sell the reflective look. Think of it like adding the sparkle. It's what makes everything feel finished. Speaking of white, it's time to tackle the base. I'm using contrast paint, or Xpress color, as Vallejo calls it. For that to work properly, you need a bright, solid base coat underneath. Pro tip: don't mix in any thinners with your white base coat. Just use pure water. Contrast paint doesn't play well with thinners. The mediums repel each other and you'll end up with a weird, splotchy mess. For the floor paneling, I'm keeping it simple, just using some metallic paint and then weathering it down. Nothing fancy, just enough to sell the idea of worn metal under their boots. Sometimes the base doesn't need to shout, it just needs to support the story. For the ground, I'm going with a dark desert look. I mixed two different Xpress colors to create some natural variation, emphasizing highlights and shadows across the base. Vallejo's Xpress colors are a bit lighter than Games Workshop's contrast, so I usually do 2 layers. But here's the key: wait a good long while between coats. Even if it looks dry, it might still be curing underneath. If you rush it, you risk tearing the surface or reactivating the paint. For the smoke and fire coming out of the jetpack, I start by coating the whole trail in fluorescent red. Trust me, it'll make sense in a minute. I also mix in some orange as well for some temperature differences. While the red dries, I'm trying out a few different special effect paints from Vallejo on the metallic base. Honestly, I think these are some of the better effects paints you can get. They add just the right amount of grime, rust, or wear without much effort. Next, I go in with some aggressive stippling and dry brushing using a light steel color to add wear and tear. It roughs up the surface just enough to sell the look of scratched, worn metal. Alright, back to the flames and smoke. I've got some Vallejo charcoal on the wet palette. No water added this time. Using a cheap brush, I start stippling and dry brushing it onto the smoke clouds. This technique works great because, as the smoke rises away from the flames, it cools down and turns black, but you still catch little glimpses of the fire glowing deep inside. It adds depth and a more realistic burn effect. You'll end up covering most of the orange and red with the charcoal, and that's expected. But be careful. Once the flames are painted over, they're tough to bring back. So take your time. Stipple a bit, then take a step back and look at the model as a whole. You want to see just a hint of that orange and red glow from most angles, but only deep inside the smoke. That's what sells the heat without losing the contrast. For the male Mando, I wanted his blaster pistols to tie in a bit more with his armor, so I gave the slides a coat of Gunmetal Blue, a paint I've actually never used before. And now, the final step before varnishing, adding pigments to the base to give it a more earthy, grounded feel. I also dusted a bit onto their boots and knee pads to tie everything together and sell the realism. I used some pigment binder to lock it all in, then let it sit and fully cure before hitting it with varnish. It's a subtle step, but it really pulls the whole piece together. Thanks for hanging out while I painted up these covert Mandos. Hopefully it gave you some ideas for your own squad. Until next time, happy painting!